He was doing what he always did at night, moving light across scuffed linoleum, following the rhythm of a mop like a metronome. The fluorescent lights hummed above, casting everything in the Rose City Dojo a sickly, patient glare. Mats rolled against the walls. A row of black belts hung like dark leaves on a hook. The smell of sweat, leather, and floor polish folded into the air. Grant Miller worked quietly, sleeves rolled, a janitor's blue uniform clinging at the elbows as he pushed the mop forward and back. Someone in the crowd laughed, a sharp, practiced sound that carried a little too easily through the training hall. Tyler Rhodes, the head instructor, stood halfway between the tatami and the spectator benches, a black belt tied tidy at his waist, his jaw set the way it always was when he wanted an audience. He liked being watched. He liked the tilt of the room toward him. He liked the ripple of approval when he was clever or cruel. "Hey, you with the mop," Tyler called, loud enough for the student body to quiet and turn. "Come up here and give us a little show. Let's see if all those moves of yours translate to the real thing." The jeer folded into a chorus. A few people clapped like it was a private joke. Others shifted uneasily, sensing the edges of something mean. Grant froze. His hand tightened around the mop handle. For a flicker of a moment, the mop looked foolish in his grip, an actor's prop instead of an instrument he'd used to steady breathing for years. He could have kept sweeping. He should have kept sweeping. He had bills. He had a daughter with a school project due the next morning. He had a life made up of small, careful actions meant to keep herself fed and safe. But he had also carried other things for 2 decades, things that did not respect the smallness of a janitor's night shift. He had a body taught to move with a particular economy. He had a past that fit poorly into this cheap blue shirt. Grant set the mop against the wall. He walked toward the mat. The room altered in the space of 2 steps. Conversations thinned like a pulled seam. A kid snickered and then swallowed the sound. Piper's picture, tucked like a talisman in his wallet, felt warm against his hip. He could imagine her asleep in their 1-bedroom apartment, a dinosaur nightlight painting the ceiling with ghosts. She expected him home by midnight. He would be home by midnight. That thought held him like a lodestar. The way his hands needed to be steady at dinner, how he needed to be patient when homework turned into bargaining, how struggle could not become spectacle every time someone needed to prove something. Tyler was smiling then, the predatory smile of a man certain of the ending he wanted. "Come on," he said, "show us what you know. Put on a mask for these folks." Megan O'Reilly pushed through the crowd in a quick step that was more annoyance than surprise. She was a purple belt, a grad student in sports psychology who kept her hands loose and her face honest. She knew the mechanics of humiliation almost as well as she knew the mechanics of a choke. She liked to read people the way they read posture. She studied Tyler's cadence the way she studied a subject's breathing in the lab. Tonight, he was primed. Hunger threaded through his posture like a second belt. "This isn't a show, Tyler," Megan said, voice clear enough for a few heads to turn. "This is a training exercise, not a circus. Take it down a notch." Tyler laughed a little. He pivoted his chin toward Grant with a movement meant to be magnanimous. "This will be good for him," he said. "A little stick with the big dogs. Don't be shy, janitor. Show us the Phantom's tricks." Someone said the word quietly, almost as if testing it. Phantom. Others came up against it, title, names and images like flares from a time before this gym had been built. The Phantom was a ghost in the dojo's oral history, an ex-champion whose name hovered around veterans' conversations and was usually recited with a shake of the head and a rueful smile. Grant had been good at fading out of the world that way. He had left it because leaving was the only way forward for him. Grant climbed onto the mat. His shoes came off. The hall's coolness lifted at the soles of his feet. He felt the friction of the tatami like a first contact with truth, sudden and grounding. He pulled his jacket off and folded it over the bench.
A couple of kids nudged one another, waiting for what would come next. "Just for fun," Tyler said, as though that phrase absolved anything. "No rules, no choking, no tap-outs. We'll see how much you've sharpened that old edge." Nobody present could have known how many nights Grant had sharpened into edge, or why some edges belonged sheathed. They could not know the memory that lived under his ribs, the flash of lights in Vegas, the slap of rope, the way a friend's breath had gone wrong the night he lost control. They could not know that an accident, 2 hands and a scramble that turned to something else, reverberated through his life like an unspent currency. Once, movement had been the way he loved people. Once, it had killed his friend. Not intentionally, not maliciously, but in the horrific smallness of that night, everything turned and could not be turned back. He had walked away when the court said the thing was over, and there were no more questions. He had walked away because every time he raised his hands in training, he could feel the gravity of that loss pressing into the inside of his skull. Grant breathed. He felt the mop handle's ghost in the lockers. He was, in other circles, a man who moved with a particular subtlety. Economy, timing, weight transfer, all the unpronounced vocabulary of a fighter who had learned that power lay in small gestures. Those gestures had cost him too much. They had cost Jack Morrison a life. The name came up unbidden. He hadn't said it aloud in years. Megan watched him in a way that narrowed time to the space between heartbeats. She had seen fighters before who had left at the top, who now stood in doorways letting their own histories become rumor. She'd seen something else in Grant, a restraint that read like conscience, a muscle memory kept from harming. She moved a step forward, less to stop Tyler than to anchor Grant, to put a witness in his orbit who would later tell the truth about why he did what he did. "Let's keep it technical," Megan said, with a softer authority. "Respect each other out there. If it's a demo, then demo. Don't make it mean." Tyler rolled his shoulders. "Suit yourself, but don't act hurt if he crawls back under his mop." He offered a respectful bow, insincere, and then squared his stance. The students spread out like a frame, their phones raised now, the little lights of screens painting everyone in a faint electric blue. In the corner, a teenage brown belt named Cole Turner whispered to Nina Morales. "He looks smaller than the videos," Cole said. Nina's eyes were wide. "Or maybe older," she replied. Both of them were wrong. Grant only looked like what he'd been, someone who had learned to live on edges and carry silence. When the bell that never really rang in the dojo's modern life was called by a rustle, Tyler's first motion, it happened like the release of a held breath. Grant's body moved. The room contracted. Strike 1, a probing jab. Tyler intended it to be loud, to puncture the air. He wanted reaction, contact, a spectacle. Grant stepped off the line. Not much, just a hair's breadth. That small misalignment did not look like skill to the untrained eye. It looked like luck. But the mathematics of balance are unforgiving. 1 degree off and the committed weight of an attack carries its owner past the mark. There was a noise in the hall now, the proximity of breathing amplified. When you watch a practiced athlete, you learn that their sounds are part of the art. Tyler's breath was a machine rhythm, sharp inhales, fast exhale. Grant's breath was a river, steady and low. He was cataloging where the crowd leaned, the angle of Tyler's lead foot, the fraction of a second Tyler's shoulder rose. Tyler came harder, a hook, then a straight. He threw power at the demonstration because power was the language he had chosen for himself, louder, faster, more visible. Grant did nothing dramatic. He moved his weight rather than his limbs. He pivoted not to dodge, but to guide. He absorbed the moment that was thrust at him and turned it into a lever. Timing is not mystical. It is arithmetic. It is listening. He felt the arc of Tyler's punch and placed his palm on Tyler's sternum, not to damage, but to collect. For a second, the world was nothing but 2 hands and the gap between intention and reality. The contact was gentle, a place of connection, and then the transfer. Tyler's forward momentum went out through his feet and left him with no base. Grant used his own center like a fulcrum. He led Tyler's center of gravity forward while he moved his own just out of the line. It looked abrupt because humans expect violence to be loud. The move was quiet. It was an economy of motion. One touch. The students' phones captured the descent as if in slow motion. Tyler's face registered confusion, first, instead of triumph. Then he was off balance and angles failed him. He fell, not dramatically, not in a way that suggested humiliation as sport, but he went sprawling across the mat, arms splayed for a rapid recovery that did not come. The impact sounded like a muted thud that seemed to remove the sound from the rest of the room. Silence. The sort of silence that is not empty, but full of recalibration. No one laughed. A child's jaw dropped. Megan's mouth opened just enough to recompose sentences into new ones. Cole stopped whispering mid-word. Tyler's breath was quick now. He looked at his hands as if they were suddenly unfamiliar objects. For a man whose identity rotated around winning, losing had a particular taste, raw, metallic, and immediate. Grant stood where he had been, mop forgotten, palms cooling at his sides. His shirt stuck to his ribs. His toes made a small imprint on the mat where the traction had annoyed him. He could see a smear of something, sweat or floor polish, catch the light at the edge of the tatami. He felt the sound of the crowd pressing into him, the old reflex that said, "Say something, prove yourself, tell them why." He did not move to gloat, and he did not move to help. He only unclenched his hands because it felt like the right thing to do, and because the years had taught him that victory did not require a parade. Tyler's face twisted from rage to confusion to something near shame. His voice, when it came out, was small. What was that? It was not a demand. It was the single question that would reframe the next hour. Megan was already moving. Her phone was in her palm by muscle memory. She tapped with the kind of rapid competence that comes from living between an academic schedule and practice mats. Her fingers searched for the thing she half expected to find: old footage, an archived interview, a name attached to a highlight reel. The little blue glow of her screen cut across her face. Behind it, someone in the back of the room whispered, "Phantom?" as if testing whether the word would still grow teeth. Images fill in faster than words sometimes. People's memories are sculpted from scraps. There were clips on the internet, improbable now and grainy then. Grant raising his hands, a flash of a face in the cheering crowd, a headline about a 5-time world champion who disappeared. The rumor mill had turned his absence into legend.
That order had tipped. Grant finally spoke. His voice was low. "I don't want a show," he said. "I came because you asked." He could feel the words bleeding the history from his chest. He didn't want pity tonight. He didn't want a gallery either. He wanted, maybe selfishly, to measure the kind of man he had become against the kind of man he once had been. "Then let's keep this clean," Tyler snapped, less command than an attempt to reclaim the evening. He was breathing faster now. His eyes were lit with something that could be called anger, or perhaps an attempt at saving face through movement. "We'll do a spar, light contact, start from the center." His attempt at ritual was automatic. He wanted the structure that a bout provided: signals, respect, an outcome he could own. The students formed a ring, and for a second, the dojo felt like the old days. The origin myth of any martial hall is about practice stabilized by rules. Here, rules were demanded like armor. Grant nodded because he knew them. He crouched, measured. The mop was now propped against a bench like an altar. Piper's drawing, an awkward son with a smile, poked out from his wallet when he adjusted. It looked at him like an accusation and a benediction at once. The next exchange was a test. Tyler came out with a sequence meant to push the pace. Feints, a stepping pattern designed to disrupt, a low sweep aimed to show dominance if it landed.
Grant read not the show, but the geometry. He stepped off the line again, not to flee, but to create an angle where Tyler's momentum would carry him. He felt for the place where physics would help, the place where a move intended to hurt could instead be used to show how very little force is necessary to alter a course. They traded positions. Tyler launched something that would have flattened a less cautious man. He felt confident. The crowd's volume rose again, but this time it was careful. Like spectators at a ballet where someone might break into a lyric and everyone knew the pain that would follow. When Tyler misstepped, it was a hair's breadth. It was not an error that would have mattered if the stage had not been a strip of mat, but a slight imbalance in the hips allowed Grant to insert a palm on the sternum once more, the same quiet touch. Grant's hand was not a weapon, it was an intervention. He guided, led, redirected. Tyler's foot left the ground. He tried to correct and could not find the pivot. He fell forward, slower this time, as if gravity were reluctant to accept his presence. When he hit the mat, he landed with a sound that reverberated through the bodies watching. Laughter died. Admiration and unease took its place. A ripple spread. Someone clicked a camera, someone clasped their hands over their mouth. Someone else inhaled as if to summon an explanation that did not exist. Tyler lay there, breathing hard, eyes on Grant, not with the spark of battle, but with an embarrassment that stains deeply.
For a man used to being the center of spectacle, falling without dramatic recovery felt like being stripped. Grant stood. He did not raise his fists to the room. He did not strike a victorious pose. He inhaled and let out a breath as if he had been holding it for years. His voice when he spoke was not loud. It needed no volume. "I'm not here to win anything," he said. "I'm here so you go home without thinking hitting harder proves anything." The words landed like stones skipping on water. They were not a rebuke. They were a boundary. Megan's eyes found him, and for a long second there was a look that acknowledged pain without trying to fix it. She moved closer, laced a hand over Tyler's wrist, and helped him sit up. Her touch was neither triumphant nor gentle. It was assessment, like a doctor checking a pulse to make sure a patient was still present. Tyler did not get to compose a response. The students closed around the ring, murmuring. Group dynamics are crafty. They adjust reputations as if tailoring clothes. Some people found respect instantly where they had been tossed aside. Others slipped. Someone asked, "Is he the videos?" As if a digital archive could become a moral passport. Grant lowered his gaze. He felt the weight of a gaze that wanted to reconcile what it thought it knew with what it had just seen. He thought of Jack again, and the old ache that came with remembrance. The truth of that night had no redemption easy enough to utter in a gym's fluorescent light. But the movement he had just made, the transfer of momentum, the economy, was a way to speak without words. It was a demonstration that power could be shaped differently. It was not absolution. It was not comeback. It was, at best, an attempt to teach through physical language what he had learned the hard way, that strength without restraint can become a weapon against those we love. That thought, careful restraint as the measure of responsibility, sat in the room like a new doctrine. Kids scanned each other's faces, trying to calibrate their loyalties. Tyler's jaw clenched. He looked small and big at once. A man who had been up on the podium, now looking at a different podium and not liking the view. Megan stepped forward and put her phone down on the bench with the screen face up, though she did not turn it on. She waited. There was a moment when everyone in the hall held their breath, waiting to see whether the narrative would be chased by punchy headlines, whether someone would clamber to reclaim the story and make it Sunday news. Grant bowed briefly, an automatic, ancient motion that cleared the air more politely than any word could, and then walked off the mat. He picked his mop up and kept sweeping, like the world was still what it had been before someone called his name into the fluorescent light. But he was not the same man who had climbed up a few minutes earlier. The city outside would still be the city. Piper would still be waiting up for homework help. Bills still would need paying. But the way the room had tilted in his direction had carved out a new possibility,
that he could stand close to motion and not be the kind of man who must use it to destroy. As he slid his jacket on, a few students circled him, curiosity in their face. A hand on his shoulder, an awkward, tentative, nice, a whisper, "Are you," broke into fragments. He nodded, answered a few questions with a practiced vagueness, and moved through the door like a tide easing out. Megan watched him go. She had a feeling that the night was not finished. The kind of revelation she suspected needed a careful hand, an ethical lens. She knew the internet's appetite for spectacle. She understood that revelation of Grant's identity could either lift him up in hero worship or tear him down with salvaged footage of a life half-lived in mistake and brilliance. She considered the weight of telling the truth fully, without the sensationalism that makes victims into props and comeback stories into merchandise. In the back, someone had already started to whisper about the videos. "The Phantom," they said, and the word rolled through the hall like a small thunderclap. Yet even as gossip braided itself into fact, the room felt different. The lesson had landed not as a single moralizing line, but as a quiet demonstration. There are ways to use force that repair rather than harm. Outside, the night had cooled. Neon from a closed diner painted the sidewalk in bands of tired color. Grant locked the dojo door with hands that knew the motion of bolts and the tiny economies of repairs. He walked to the transit stop, his backpack slung low, thinking of Piper's homework spread on the kitchen table and of how, tomorrow, he would boil eggs and help conjugate verbs and not mention the mat at all if she asked. He had learned how to compartmentalize. He had learned that sometimes the safest thing was to carry the weight alone. But the mat had a way of catching people. It held memory like dew. That night, as he walked home beneath sodium lamps, the dojo's brightness receded behind him, and a new thing followed: attention. Not all attention was welcome, not all attention was safe. Yet there was also a hint of something else. Maybe, if people were willing, a chance that a small lesson about restraint could become a larger rule. Inside the dojo, Megan lingered. The glow of her phone finally called her back. Her fingers hovered over the screen. She had come to study people's motivations and mistakes. She had chosen a field that trusted scientific method more than spectacle. But her discipline also required compassion, a curiosity about why people did what they did. Tonight, the why was complicated. She opened a browser, typed a single name, and let the feed populate. The first result was old, its edges blurred by compression and nostalgia. A video thumbnail showed a young fighter rising with his hand raised in the center of a ring. A small caption said, "5-time champion disappears." Megan's fingers paused. She closed the browser for a moment, then reopened it with the care of someone who knew that a story only lived as long as it could be told honestly. She took a breath and scrolled further, beyond the highlights and the rumor-mongering, toward actual interviews and a piece that had once tried to explain departure without forgiving consequence. In a distant part of the hall, Tyler gathered his pride in one fist and his ego in the other. He sat alone on the bench, watching the scuffs on the mat like they were a map to a new route. He had never expected to be shown how to fall by a man he had called a janitor. He had also never learned how deep the consequence of a career might run when history prefers tidy endings. He stared at the drop of his own self-regard and tried to imagine how to rebuild it. For a man whose tools had always been control and instruction, this was unfamiliar terrain. The people who had laughed at the beginning of the night walked home thinking about the shape of the fall. Some felt sheepish, some felt curious. Everyone felt a little off balance. Small talk turned into something else. Questions about restraint, about the ethics of training, about mentorship. The story had become a hinge that opened other doors. Doors few had considered opening. Back on the bench, Megan's screen lit up with images and names and dates. A grainy clip played. A young man in bright trunks raising his arms, a crowd roaring, a headline that mentioned a tragedy, and an immediate step back from the public eye. Megan watched the footage and let it settle like a sediment, then typed a note into her phone. Follow up. Interview, ethics, grief, recovery. Her fingers hovered over the keys. There was work here, real work, and it would require more than a trending hashtag. At the edge of town, Piper slept curled around her dinosaur nightlight. In his pocket, Grant kept a child's drawing, a son with too many teeth and a label that read, "Dada Strong." He had been strong, once, in ways no child could understand. He had been dangerous. Now he wanted, desperately, to be reliable. He wanted to be the man who could tell his daughter to tie her shoes and mean it in every sense. When the dojo emptied and lights dimmed, a few students stayed to pick up stray G's and gear, to gossip with the caution of people who understand that narratives can break easily. They talked about the fall, about the touch, about how someone could stop a man's momentum without breaking him. For a few minutes, the conversation was about mechanics, leverage, base, timing, until it turned, inevitably, toward the ethics of power. Grant walked home under a sky that had the clean mercy of a winter night. He felt the soreness that comes from moving in ways old bones remember. He tried not to think about the footage Megan might pull up. He tried not to think what headlines would do with a man reduced to a clip.
He only wanted to be home in time for homework and story time, to tuck a small body under blankets, and to be, in simplest terms, a father who could be counted on. The evening had delivered one small, necessary shock. Spectacle had become a mirror. People had seen that mastery without mercy had consequences. People had watched a man who had been trained to end a fight teach, instead, how to stop one. And in quiet corners, Megan's notes, Tyler's shame, Grant's steady walking home, something else began. A soft, diffident curiosity about what it might mean to teach power as responsibility. The thread of the night tugged at more than muscles. It would pull at relationships, at reputations, at a dojo's culture. Someone would post a clip. Someone would ask questions. Some would demand explanation. Some would offer apology. But those were consequences for later, and the moment had not yet arrived. For now, the mat held its silence, and the city carried Grant toward his apartment and his child. And the sound of his careful footsteps mapped the only story he could promise to continue, one small, deliberate act at a time. The next morning, the clip was already a thing people passed along with the same half-ashamed curiosity they'd felt in the dojo. A brief, silent loop of a palm on a sternum and a man going down. Someone had uploaded it with a snarky caption. Someone else had trimmed it to the exact stretch of motion that looked like magic. The algorithm did what it always did. Surfaces spectacle, flattens context, and the gym's fluorescent light turned into a thumbnail that could be watched on a train in silence or at a desk with headphones. The video did not explain why the movement had been quiet. It did not contain the long nights or the courtrooms or the way grief had taught a man not to raise his hands anymore. Megan saw that clip in the feed while she was on her way to class. She watched it in a doorway and felt a professional chill, the way digital moments ate nuance and rewired public opinion. She thought about how a headline could turn a complicated life into a binary. And she worried about the people in the frame, about Grant, who had not asked for an audience, about Tyler, who had been shown falling on a mat, about the victims and the absence who would be tied to a narrative like ribbon on a gift nobody had chosen to give. She tapped again, this time not to share, but to search. The footage led to older footage, which led to archived interviews, which led inescapably to a name, Grant Miller. In those old clips, he was younger, faster, less practiced at concealment. The tag that stuck to him most places was a nickname fighters gave when they couldn't pin a person down in memory, the Phantom. There were headlines that spoke of championships, and there were stories that stopped talking when the accident was referenced. Careful, oblique sentences about an incident or a sparring accident, and then the quick move to policy changes and statements that felt like polite divorce papers. Megan closed the tabs. She did what she always did when the ethical problem felt simpler than the human one. She stepped back into the ring of people and picked up the phone. There were a few ways to narrate the truth, and she chose, deliberately, the slowest path. She sent Grant a message asking if he would talk,
if he would at least let someone listen without turning his life into a clip. She asked in the tone of someone who knew force could fix a fact, but that conversation could make amends. Grant read the message while he boiled eggs for Piper. He looked at the screen, thumb hovering. It felt heavy to say yes. Saying yes had weight, because doing so might uncork something he kept under wraps to protect the smallness of his life. But he texted back a single word: okay. He did not text a dramatic acceptance. He did not post a photograph. He simply replied with a line that meant, in his world, that he could step into a thing on his terms. If you believe true strength lies in calmness and self-respect, hit subscribe, Megan typed beneath the video share she later posted, linking to a measured, recorded conversation. The line was soft, an invitation wrapped in something practical, a nudge toward people who wanted more than spectacle. It landed in a caption box like a quiet request, an early call to stick around for nuance. She met Grant at the back corner of the dojo 2 days later, not with a camera crew, but with a notebook and a bowl of empathy. The place smelt like floor polish and old leather, and the particular dust that collects where bodies have trod for years. Grant brought with him the posture of a man who had practiced standing small. He sat and let the rectangle of quiet settle between them. "I don't want you making me into something I'm not," he said before she could ask. It was not a refusal as much as a boundary. He had been a public figure before. Now he wanted to be a person. "I don't want that either," Megan said. "I want to know how you carry this. I want to know why you walked away. The city has a way of making people into punchlines. I don't want to add one." He told her, in the slow, careful way he told most people, small sentences that did not try to fix the past so much as name it. He said the name, Jack Morrison, because it needed saying. He spoke of anger that had once felt like instrument rather than hazard, of an evening that had changed everything, of the humiliation of being cited in paper and rumor. He told her about the way grief hollowed out the center of a life, and how he had decided to do the only practical thing he could, make his primary work to keep another small person safe.
Megan took notes, but more importantly, she listened. When she later released the longer clip, an interview that was respectful, contextual, and guarded, the tone of the upload set it apart from the wider tide. She explained, in her own quick and plain way, the technical language: leverage, base, timing. She clarified that the movement had been about redirecting force, not delivering it. She was careful with Jack's name, never to sensationalize. She asked permission where permission could be asked, of Grant, of the students who witnessed the night, of the dojo. She asked questions that put ethics before virality. The response surprised no one and also surprised everyone. Some people simply shared the flashy clip. Others sat with the longer interview and read the pauses the way you read the spaces between notes. The internet does both things at once: amplify and bore down. For days, comments came in like weather, some harsh gusts, some sun. But in the dojo itself, the weather shifted in a more tangible way. Tyler's phone buzzed relentlessly. The fall had not simply been a physical event, it had altered his narrative. He had been quick to mock, quick to perform, quick to make others a ladder. Overnight, the ladder's rungs showed wear. A few senior students unfollowed him on social media. A local flyer for a weekend workshop in which he was listed as head instructor was quietly moved to pending. Parents asked questions that could not be answered with a single line. What are you teaching the kids? How do you talk about responsibility? A couple of teenagers went elsewhere to their parents and said they felt uncomfortable with the tone of the club. The dojo, which had been a small ecosystem of rivalries and warm-ups, felt, for the first time in years, like a place that needed governance beyond tradition. Tyler, left with that quiet, had two choices: double down or look. He did both, in the messy way humans do. At first, he posted a defensively worded caption about respecting the craft and how no one should be judged by a single clip.
The post gathered comments like a magnet picks up filings, some agreeing, many not. He tried long training sessions, the kind of physical work that fills up the spaces when moral work is harder. He lost students slowly. Not all of them left. Some stayed, interested in the drama. But a handful of promising ones transferred to other schools where the head instructor had a different temperament. Those departures bit into Tyler's pride more than he expected. It was Megan who, after a week of watching the scene fray, suggested accountability as a practice rather than an ad. "You have to own what happened," she told Tyler softly when she found him alone in the dojo late one night, hands wrapped around a water bottle. "Not because you need to be publicly castigated, but because your students need to know you are learning to be better." Tyler's first response was a list of excuses. He talked about the pressure of competitions, about how teaching is different from fighting, about how a single mistake in a match did not make a man a villain. Megan listened, then asked a clarifying question that left a bruise. "But what did you learn about how you treated someone who didn't want to be in the show?" He had no immediate answer. The question sat with him like the aftertaste of a match, metallic and wrong. Grant did not expect an apology. He had been surprised by the attention and did not cherish the idea of Tyler's contrition as an immediate balm. But he understood, in the plain way he understood ropes and rules, that restitution is not a one-off word. It is a practice. Megan mediated the first conversation. Tyler reached out, awkward, hands shaking, and asked to meet. He wanted to apologize in person, not on social media where words could be bent into applause. They met in the cheap sunlight pouring through the dojo windows. Tyler's voice was smaller than his bravado. He said the words, "I'm sorry," and then added things that made the apology feel less performative. "I didn't think. I wanted to be the center. I made someone into a spectacle." He looked at Grant not pleading for absolution, but asking to be taught what it meant to stand differently. The apology was not an erasure. Tyler's humility felt raw and uncertain. It needed action to take shape. Grant listened. There was no cinematic absolution, no instant forgiveness. He accepted the apology slowly and with clear terms. He asked for practical commitments. No more public put-downs, a class for safe sparring protocols, an invitation to bring in guest teachers who focused on technique and control rather than brute force. He made Tyler promise to work, not simply post. Tyler agreed, and the agreement became the blueprint of his atonement. Megan offered to help design the class, to structure it around the science of learning and the ethics of contact. Change followed in small increments. Tyler started taking responsibility in visible, measurable ways. He lost a few students who didn't want to continue with him. He kept others who saw a teacher who was willing to hold himself accountable. He began each class with a short talk about consent and safety, a practice borrowed from Grant's insistence on restraint. He no longer made spectacle of newcomers. He demoted himself from center stage bravado to an instructor who monitors drills and corrected footwork with an eye for timing and base rather than dominance. The dojo itself changed. The club that had once rewarded the loudest voice began to prize rigor and respect. Tyler opened the floor to guest instructors on a rotating basis, wrestlers who specialized in takedowns that emphasized control, grapplers who taught how to fall without injury, and even a physical therapist who explained how to read pain signals. The students learned how to protect each other, how to call a stop, how to tap with honor without seeing it as failure. The dojo itself changed. The club that had once rewarded the loudest voice began to prize rigor and respect. Tyler opened the floor to guest instructors on a rotating basis, wrestlers who specialized in takedowns that emphasized control, grapplers who taught how to fall without injury, and even a physical therapist who explained how to read pain signals. The students learned how to protect each other, how to call a stop, how to tap with honor without seeing it as failure. Megan taught a short module on motivation and aggression. She had the students fill out reflective journals. Those journals, at the beginning, were full of performative lines about hard work. Months later, they held paragraphs about things the kids rarely expected to be asked. Who are you trying to impress? What responsibility do you owe your training partner? Grant came back into the dojo in a very particular way. He did not put on a gi right away, or step into an instructor's role like someone reclaiming a throne. He came as a neighbor. He swept the floors, organized the storage room, fixed a broken locker with the same quiet competence as he repaired teeth on a toy at home. He lent specific observations during drills with candor, and rarely offered the spectacle of demonstration. When he did show technique, it was always with an emphasis on teaching. Slow motion, explanation of weight transfer, clear cautions about where danger lay. He corrected a foot here, a distribution of weight there. Students who came for flashy blows stayed for the way his instructions slowed the world and made the math of motion comprehensible. He also kept his day job. He still left at night to boil eggs and help with homework. His domestic life and his public life were not two kingdoms. They were a single ledger he balanced every day. Piper remained the center of his small universe. He watched her learn multiplication at the kitchen table, her small tongue between her teeth in concentration. He learned the shorthand of small parenting, where to hide carrots and mac and cheese, how to encourage a child whose handwriting bent like a riverbank. He listened to her awkward stories about classmates and tucked away complaints about uncool teachers. He did not talk often about the dojo at home. When Piper asked, he gave simple answers. "I helped someone not get hurt," he would say, and she would nod, satisfied with that simplicity. During these months, a few formal things happened. A local paper ran a piece that did not sensationalize, but tried, clumsily, to make sense of the human elements in play. Megan contributed to that piece by offering context, how to read the physics of a takedown and how to read the ethics of restraint. The reporter asked about Jack Morrison and about the accident that had prompted Grant's withdrawal. The conversation took a tone of measured respect. The paper included interviews with old students who spoke of how Grant had once dissolved into private life after the accident, and with parents who now expressed a guarded gratitude for classes that taught safety. The coverage was not a coronation. It simply placed the story into a local frame where people could see themselves in it. There were other consequences less visible than press. A parent who had once thought Tyler's toughness necessary for discipline withdrew their child.
An older instructor from another gym sent a message to Tyler that read, in part, "If you ever want to scrub mats and learn how to teach, come by." The message was not condescension so much as a recognition of a cultural shift in martial arts toward consent and a pedagogy of care. Megan's interviews and pieces turned into something practical, a proposal for a safety workshop that combined physical skills with psychological framing. She arranged a weekend clinic, one day focused on falling and recovery, another on drills for controlled entries and exits from contact, another on how instructors could model ethical teaching. Grant led a module on restraint, Tyler led one on footwork, and Megan supervised reflective sessions where students wrote about how it felt to be held accountable. The weekend was not perfect. Old habits rose. Some students resisted the slower work. But the magnetism of seeing a man who had been a champion teach how to not use force shifted hearts. People began to show up who had never come before. Parents looking for a safer environment, former students seeking a chance to reconcile. Time rolled forward measured in small dramatic beats rather than single sensational moments. Tyler's apology did not erase the fall, but it became a hinge around which new practice rotated. He lost some status, yes, but he acquired something that mattered more, a capacity to listen. He showed up for additional training with Grant and co-taught classes that focused on technique rather than bravado. Watching Tyler at first was like watching a person relearn a language. He stumbled, he pronounced things incorrectly, but he kept returning. His students appreciated the change. They saw the practical repaying of words with action. The community responded in other ways. Parents formed a committee to create clear safety protocols for all dojos in the area. A small nonprofit reached out asking if the Rose City Dojo would host a youth program combining discipline with mentorship.
It was precisely the sort of invitation Grant accepted in a measured way. He agreed to lead a weekly class for kids deemed at risk, but only if the program came with support, a counselor, a sliding fee system, and a rule that any instructor would be vetted not only for skill, but for the way they cared for partners. The net result was modest at first, 10 kids, 2 volunteers, and a borrowed budget, but the work felt right. At the heart of the change, Grant kept a steady rhythm. He taught the new youth class not from a throne, but from a mat, kneeling sometimes to tie laces or to coax a child back into a drill. He listened to a boy who had anger issues and refused to learn at first. He spoke to a girl who refused to fall. He taught through metaphor sometimes, moving like money across a ledger, conserving energy, doing the small things that kept a body and a community intact. Months later, the dojo hosted a small memorial service for Jack Morrison.
It was quiet and unshowy, just a circle of people with a couple of poems and short remarks. Grant spoke, but he did not craft a speech to elevate himself. He spoke of responsibility. He said Jack's name plainly, and not as a title, but as a person. He described Jack as someone who had loved the sport and who had been a friendship that had shaped him. He refused to make the accident an instrument for self-justification. He spoke about the grief that had taught him to be small, and the obligation to turn that smallness into something that kept others safe. Tyler came to the memorial too. He did not stand on the edge hedging for a photo op. He stood in the back, hands folded, listening. There was no expected forgiveness. There was only attendance and the sense that attendance mattered. After the service, Tyler approached the stone where a small bouquet had been placed and left a single, modest offering of his own. The gesture was not theatrical. It was a small, human act of remembrance. The afternoons after the memorial fell into a pattern that felt like repair. The youth program grew to 20 kids, then 40. Some parents said the dojo felt like a place where their children could be strong and safe, where teachers had terms for what training meant and how to handle failure without shaming. The city, always hungry for a new feel-good angle, covered the program once in an article that respected the nuance. No miracle narratives, just a simple account of a community trying to do better. Grant began to earn more than just his day labor wages. The dojo paid him a modest stipend to help run the youth program. It did not make him rich. It did not erase the way long-term financial precarity weighed on him. But it did bring a kind of stability he had not expected. Enough to fix a leaky roof, enough to enroll Piper in an after-school math club she loved, enough for small comforts that used to be luxuries. He still worked nights. He still boiled eggs. But now, when he swept the mat, there were kids who watched him with the kind of attention that had nothing to do with fame and everything to do with trust. Piper grew with the rhythm. She learned her father's work ethic not as a spectacle, but as ordinary grit. She sat in the lobby sometimes with a book while the class ran, and she beamed when a child gave her a drawing. Once, she asked him a question that landed like a feather. "Do you miss the lights, Daddy?" Grant thought for a moment, then answered truthfully. "Sometimes," he said. "I miss it, but not like I thought I would. I miss who I was before I knew everything could be broken. Now, I like that I can be here when you need me." Piper nodded, as if that was the exact kind of answer she wanted. It was small, but in the ledger of his life, it counted. As the months accumulated, Grant's public profile softened into something that held no pride and a lot of usefulness. He did a handful of interviews with local outlets at Megan's insistence, always insistence that phrasing be careful and humane. Megan was protective in an efficient way. She shielded him from clickbait and helped redirect the conversation away from spectacle and onto responsibility. The interviews became seeds. A couple of other dojos called to ask about the program's curriculum. A sports therapist asked to collaborate on a safety module. The small, diligent work multiplied quietly. There were setbacks. An internet poster dug up an old headline and tried to reframe Grant as a villain. Someone else wrote a comment that spoke of Jack as a statistic. Those moments stung. Grant felt the old reflexes of hiding.
Sometimes he took a night off from public conversations and drove to a quiet place on the river where the city noises thinned and the only sound was the slosh of water. He would sit for a long time and let the surface of things show him how small his movements were. He would think of Jack and of Piper and measure his days by the number of small, steady acts he could perform without self-aggrandizement. Megan kept working. Her notes turned into a short paper on coaching ethics that she presented at a conference on youth sports. It was not revolutionary. It was not meant to be. Its value lay in its practicalness. How to teach kids consent in contact sports. How to structure sparring so that harm was minimized. How to place grief acknowledgement at the center of pedagogy. She referenced the Rose City Dojo as a case study without naming people unnecessarily. The paper was shared among coaches and, slowly, filtered into how some clubs framed their classes. Tyler did the slow, sometimes ugly work of repair. He taught less as a showman and more as a steward. He instituted a mandatory talk pattern and check-in for every class. He asked seniors to pair with juniors in mentorship roles, and he held himself accountable when errors happened in practice. Over time, students began returning. Some of the kids who had left came back to test the new tone and stayed because it felt safer. Tyler's ego did not vanish, but it reconfigured. He discovered that being a teacher could mean being humble in front of questions he couldn't answer. There was a particular day several months on when the dojo, not the city, not a paper, just the small patch of mats, felt like a workshop of repaired hearts. Kids were doing drills with a focus that had the purity of practice. Parents watched, their faces soft with relief. Tyler led warm-ups, but paused to let Grant demonstrate a footwork drill that focused on how to break base without forcing a partner. When Grant moved, the room watched differently than they had the first night. There was no hunger for spectacle. There was gratitude for the clarity of instruction. After practice, a parent named Mrs. Alvarez approached Grant and said, simply, "Thank you for teaching them how to fall." Her eyes were damp with a relief that had nothing to do with online fame. Grant nodded and felt, for the first time in years, that he had been permitted to let his life be useful without needing to be a headline. That winter, on a bleak morning that still held the hush of long, cold nights, Grant took Piper to the cemetery. The grave was a place of small, private devotion rather than any grand monument. The headstone had a simple name and date, nothing more than a human anchor. Piper brought a plastic toy dinosaur and placed it on the grass with the earnestness of a child offering treasure. She looked up at her father and said the kind of straightforward thing children say, "Daddy, why did Jack die?" Grant crouched so his eyes were at her level. He touched the stone with a hand that had known the discipline of not striking. He spoke in the kind of sentences that are spare because they must avoid making complex things simple. "It was an accident," he said. "Sometimes people get hurt when we don't know how to stop. Jack was my friend. I miss him. That's why I try to teach people how to stop safely and how to care for each other." Piper nodded. She did not argue. Children have a way of accepting restraint as an ordinary fact when adults present it without drama. They stood together in a small silence that held the weight of the past and the work of the present. Grant rested his hand on the stone the way someone rests a palm on a table while thinking. He did not seek to undo what had happened. He sought instead to live differently on the other side of it. When they returned to the dojo that day, they found that someone had left a small handwritten note on the notice board. "For Jack and for everyone who teaches the right way." That sentence, anonymous and brief, felt like a benediction. It was evidence, in its smallness, that the community had shifted. The board was not a monument, but the note was proof that conversations had seeped into the walls. The months that followed were not a simple redemptive arc. Life is rarely a single line. There were nights when Grant came home exhausted and angry at the sound of small injustices that had nothing to do with his life but which still lodged in his ribs. There were nights when Piper's list of projects grew and his bank account did not. But there were also mornings when a child in the youth program would greet him with a hug. There were afternoons when Tyler would bring an extra set of mats to a class, hands working without fanfare. There were more and more parents who said, "We feel safer," and who meant it. The real change was in small moments. In a sparring drill, Tyler corrected his own technique when it threatened to become a shove. In a youth class, a child tapped out quickly and no one laughed. In the way Megan organized a forum about sportsmanship where high school captains argued in earnest about responsibility, not status.
In the way Grant, when asked to demonstrate, would sometimes opt to show a drill that emphasized balance over force, and the room would quiet to learn rather than to cheer. A year after the night the mop became a stage, the Rose City Dojo held a small community day. People came from nearby gyms, mothers brought picnics to watch the kids, and a local councilwoman gave a short speech about youth programs. It was modest, practical, and full of a tender gravity. Tyler led an acknowledgement that would have seemed foreign to his former self. He spoke about learning to listen, about the cost of spectacle, and about regret. His voice held less swagger and more steadiness. Grant stood beside him, not as a co-headliner, but as a neighbor and teacher. They announced a joint scholarship for kids who could not afford tuition, an institutional lesson turned into policy. The scholarship was modest, a few slots, but it signified that the dojo's culture had evolved into something with checks and balances, a structure that outlasted single personalities. The event closed with a quiet ceremony in which the group lit candles for those lost to accidents in the sport, a short, solemn moment that respected the boundary between memory and exploitation. Grant held Piper's small hand as the lights flickered. He felt the presence of Jack in a way that was no longer an accusation but an engine for obligation. To honor someone meant to transform pain into action. People asked Grant, sometimes, if he would ever fight again. He would only shake his head and say, truthfully, that his fight now was to keep a small person safe, to teach gently and sternly in turns, to counsel young men and women who wanted the rush without understanding the cost. He had found a new kind of ring, one where talk mattered as much as punch, where apologies were working documents, and where being a champion meant being available to those who needed instruction in how to wield strength without harm. The city noticed that the dojo had changed in tone more than in surface. A few other clubs invited Megan to speak. A counselor who had once sat on a parents' committee suggested that the youth program be a prototype for a program across the district. The work scaled in the slow way that durable things scale, through practices solidified and people who kept showing up. On a late afternoon that glowed with the kind of amber light that makes scarred surfaces look soft, Grant moved across the mat and watched. Kids rolled, pads were held, laughter surfaced unobtrusively. Tyler called out corrections, his voice steady. Megan sat on a bench with a thermos, grading notes quietly between watching drills. Piper, now older, sat in the corner drawing a rendition of the dojo. Tiny figures, some with belts, some holding hands. She had learned the measure of a man by a new standard, not by how loud he could be, but by how reliably he returned. Grant thought of the night he had stepped up when a taunt demanded spectacle. He felt no triumph in it now. He felt relief that the motion had become a lesson for a room and not an occasion for a lifetime of rumors. He thought too of Jack and of the private debt he would carry always, the kind of debt that does not cancel but that can, at least, be paid in small installments of care. As the practice wound down, students bowed, and people dispersed into the dusking city. The mat smelled of sweat and polish, the same old scent, but this time tempered by the presence of things learned. Grant picked up a mop, as he always did, and swept slowly. He kept the pump of the long handle in rhythm with his breath. Piper followed behind him, picking up stray tape and smiling at him with the kind of trust that had no need for public spectacle. He paused by the doorway and watched Tyler kneel with a child, demonstrating a gentle way to help someone up. Tyler did not look for applause. He looked at the young person and spoke in a low tone about how to reposition a foot. The student listened, rapt. A small thing, yes, but a visible one.
A man learning to teach without dominating. Grant's last thought before he left the mat that night was about the measure of strength. It had nothing to do with a belt or a title. It had everything to do with how you used whatever power you had. He thought about how Jack's loss had remade him to be careful, and how that carefulness could be a gift, even in a small community gym. He thought about Piper's drawing, Son with too many teeth, and how someone had to be steady enough to stay in the room when small mouths asked big questions. Outside, the night had the city's usual indifferent glow. The neon of the diner blinked patient red. Grant locked the door, the same motion he had done 100 times, and he slid his jacket on. He moved into the street with his daughter at his side. He did not expect headlines to change everything. He did not want them to. He only wanted the small daily things: to be home for homework, to be there for scraped knees, to show up for kids who needed a model of measured power. The final image, the kind that would sit in the minds of the students who had witnessed that single quiet takedown, was not of a man falling or being triumphant. It was a picture of a mat smeared faintly with sweat, a man with mop in hand, and a child whose small face looked up and trusted. And beneath that image was something like a creed. True strength isn't in knocking someone down. It's in lifting them up. If this story moved you, if the moment that changed a room matters to you, subscribe and tell us which part stayed with you in the comments. Share the story with someone who believes strength is responsibility, and let's keep talking about how we teach power well.